The studio lights burned hot as the cameras swung into position, the hum of live television pressing down like a storm about to break. Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusted her blazer, her eyes sharp and steady as the host's introduction rolled across the teleprompter. On the opposite side of the table, Pam Bondi sat with that familiar polished smile, exuding the cool confidence of someone who had weathered political storms before. But tonight was different. Tonight wasn't about Bondi herself. It was about the presence of her son, Daniel Bondi, seated uncomfortably between his mother and the host. The young man had been roped into the panel under the guise of representing the voice of a new conservative generation, though his shifting posture and nervous fidgeting betrayed how ill prepared he was for the gladiators' arena of live national debate. The audience in the studio leaned forward, sensing something in the air. Tension wasn't just brewing, it was coiling like a snake ready to strike. The host opened with a predictable question about generational divides in politics, trying to frame Daniel as a rising star with something important to say. Pam clasped his arm with subtle encouragement, nodding proudly as though her son's mere presence was proof of legacy and strength. Jasmine watched this carefully, her lips curving into the faintest trace of irony, because she knew something the world didn't know yet. She knew Daniel Bondi's past, and unlike Pam, Jasmine wasn't in the mood to pretend tonight. Daniel. The host began, his voice booming with performative gravitas. You're here as the next generation, the one carrying on the traditions your mother fought for. What do you think young Americans want from politics right now? Daniel straightened, adjusting his tie like a schoolboy about to recite a rehearsed answer. Well, he began shakily. I think what my generation wants is authenticity. You know, politicians who stand by their values, people who aren't afraid to defend what's right. He looked at his mother for approval, and Pam smiled tightly, urging him with her eyes to keep going. And I think we're tired of this culture of victimhood, of people blaming society for their failures instead of taking responsibility. The crowd gave a few half-hearted claps, clearly sensing the artificiality in his words. Jasmine tilted her head, the gleam in her eye catching the camera. Authenticity, she repeated softly but firmly. That's an interesting choice of words, Daniel. The host glanced nervously between her and the young man, sensing where this might lead. Pam stiffened, her grip tightening on her son's arm. Daniel, oblivious to the gathering storm, nodded. Yes, authenticity, people being real. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice calm but laced with steel. Then maybe it's time we talk about your real story, Daniel. Not the one rehearsed, not the one polished for TV, but the one you've been hiding. The air in the studio shifted instantly. A murmur rippled through the live audience as Pam's smile faltered, her knuckles whitening against the table. Excuse me, she cut in, her voice sharp. What exactly are you implying? Representative Crockett. Jasmine didn't look at Pam. She kept her gaze locked on Daniel, whose face was beginning to drain of color. I'm implying that America deserves to know the truth about who sits here telling us about responsibility, about how young people should live. Because authenticity, Daniel, real authenticity means being honest about your past. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening under the studio lights. The cameras zoomed closer, the director in the control room whispering furiously to the crew not to cut away. This was television gold, and everyone knew it. What truth are you referring to? Pam demanded, her voice rising as her carefully managed composure slipped. This is reckless, Jasmine. You don't drag family members into politics. Jasmine finally turned her gaze on Pam, eyes flashing. I don't drag family members into politics. But when someone is dragged onto live television to speak about values, knowing full well the skeletons rattling in their closet, then I simply refuse to stay silent. Daniel shifted, his hands trembling as he reached for his glass of water. The host tried to intervene, stammering something about staying on topic, but Jasmine cut him off with the authority of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. You see, she said, her voice steady and cutting, Daniel knows what it means to hide. He knows what it means to wear a mask. Because while his mother was out lecturing America on law and order, Daniel was busy being arrested for felony possession, disorderly conduct, and assault charges that somehow never saw the light of day in the national press. Gasps erupted from the audience. The host froze, caught between the duty to moderate and the irresistible magnetism of raw political theatre. Pam shot forward in her chair, her face flushed crimson. "That is an outrageous lie!" she thundered. "You have no right to smear my family on national television." But Daniel's face told the story before words could. His jaw quivered, his eyes darted nervously from the cameras to his mother, and in that moment the weight of unspoken truth cracked the farce aid. "Is it a lie, Daniel?" Jasmine asked quietly, her words slicing sharper than Pam's screams. "Is it a lie, or is it just inconvenient for America to hear? Did you not spend 6 months in a juvenile detention center after the police caught you with a stolen vehicle? Did you not have those records sealed because of your mother's influence?" Daniel's lips parted, but no sound came out. His hands trembled violently, the glass of water tipping slightly as he gripped it with desperate strength. Pam snapped, "Don't answer that, Daniel. She's baiting you. This is beneath you." But silence can be the loudest answer of all, and in that silence, the audience heard everything they needed to. Phones lit up in the crowd, Twitter feeds exploding with hashtags as viewers across the nation clipped the moment, posting it online before the broadcast even ended. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable, but her eyes gleamed with something both fierce and resolute. "America asked for authenticity," she said softly into the camera. And tonight it got it. The studio descended into chaos, the kind of unplanned, electric chaos that producers secretly live for and publicists dread with every fibre of their being. Pam Bondi's perfectly rehearsed composure cracked like thin glass under pressure, and the fury in her voice carried across the stage as she slammed a hand on the table. "This is character assassination." "Jasmine! You're using your platform to ambush my family. You have no proof. None!" But Jasmine didn't flinch. She simply folded her hands in front of her, the calm in her voice amplifying the storm raging across from her. "Pam, you of all people should know how proof works. It's why you built a career selectively using it, hiding it, or fabricating it when convenient. And as for your son, the proof speaks for itself. Sealed records don't vanish into thin air. Court transcripts don't disappear because you wish them to. They exist, and whether you like it or not, they tell a story." Daniel's breathing grew uneven, the microphone pinned to his collar, picking up every shaky exhale. His mother reached for his hand beneath the table, but he recoiled as though her touch would only burn him further. The cameras caught the gesture, freezing it in real time for millions of viewers. Suddenly, it wasn't Jasmine's accusation alone making headlines. It was the sight of a young man cracking under the unbearable weight of his mother's shadow. The host, desperate to regain some semblance of order, cleared his throat. Representative Crockett. He began cautiously, "This program is intended for respectful political discourse. Perhaps we should." Jasmine cut him off with a glance so sharp it silenced him mid-sentence. "Respectful discourse," she repeated, her tone a scalpel slicing through hypocrisy. Respectful discourse is a luxury denied to countless young black men who never got the benefit of sealed records, who never had a mother in power to sweep their mistakes under the rug. They were thrown to the wolves, locked away, branded criminals for life. But Daniel Bondi, he gets to sit here on live television, lecturing Americans on responsibility, while his own history hides behind privilege. The audience erupted in spontaneous applause, clapping and cheering, some even rising to their feet. Pam turned toward the crowd, shaking her head furiously. "You're applauding a lie!" "My son has done nothing but fight to become the man he is today." But her protests rang hollow, drowned out by the raw, unfiltered resonance of Jasmine's words. Daniel's voice finally cracked through, trembling, fragile, a voice untrained for the brutality of politics. "Mom, stop," he whispered, but the microphone amplified it for the world to hear. Pam froze, staring at him in disbelief, but Daniel pressed on, his eyes darting toward Jasmine with a strange mixture of resentment and relief. "She's not lying," he admitted, his words stumbling out like broken glass. I did those things. I stole a car. I was arrested. I spent time in juvie. And you?" He turned on his mother, his voice growing louder, the weight of years of silence collapsing in one moment. "You made it go away. You told me to never talk about it again. You told me if I wanted a future, I had to bury it so deep that no one could find it." Pam's face turned ashen, her mouth opening but no words coming. The studio gasped collectively, the sound of hundreds of lungs seizing at once. The control room erupted in shouts, producers scrambling over headsets, debating whether to cut the feed or let the train wreck continue. But the cameras stayed fixed. America was witnessing something it hadn't seen in years, the unraveling of a political dynasty on live television. Courtesy of its own heirs, Jasmine leaned forward slowly, her voice softer now, no longer accusatory but almost maternal. "Daniel, thank you for being honest. That's not weakness. That's strength. But strength doesn't mean hiding behind your mother's influence or pretending you're something you're not. It means owning who you are, even when it's ugly, even when it hurts." Daniel's eyes welled up, his shoulders shaking under the weight of humiliation and relief colliding at once. Pam grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back into silence, but Daniel yanked away. "No, Mom! I can't do this anymore!" he shouted, his voice cracking with raw desperation. "I'm tired of being your project. I'm tired of being your proof that your politics are working. I'm not a symbol. I'm not your shield. I'm your son, and I'm broken." The audience gasped again, some covering their mouths, others whispering in disbelief. Pam's mouth worked silently, her eyes flashing with a cocktail of rage and helplessness. She was no longer the composed strategist who had spent decades spinning narratives. She was just a mother losing control of her son in front of millions. The host, his face pale with disbelief, tried again to salvage the wreck. "Perhaps we should?" But Jasmine's voice sliced through once more. "No, let this play out. Let America see what happens when power is used not to protect the truth, but to smother it." Her words landed like hammer strikes, each one deepening the fissure already cracking through the Bondi legacy. Pam, her voice trembling, tried one final retort. "You think you've exposed something here Jasmine, you think the public will side with you after watching you humiliate a young man on live television. They will see this for what it is, a political hit job. Jasmine rose from her seat, her voice calm but thundering with conviction. No, Pam. They'll see it for what it truly is, a young man suffocating under the weight of lies, finally gasping for air. Daniel buried his face in his hands, the camera zooming in on the tears streaking down his cheeks. Pam reached for him again, but this time he pulled away so forcefully that her chair scraped loudly against the studio floor, an ugly sound that echoed like the final crack of a collapsing wall. And in that instant, millions watching at home realized something Pam Bondi never wanted them to. The greatest damage hadn't come from Jasmine Crockett's revelations. It had come from the silence and secrets she had forced her own son to carry. The stage was no longer a debate. It was an open wound bleeding across every screen in America. And Jasmine, standing tall under the hot glare of the lights, didn't need to say another word. The truth had already done the work for her. The silence in the studio after Daniel's outburst was suffocating, the kind of silence that carries more weight than 1,000 shouted accusations. Pam sat frozen, her manicured hands trembling as she tried to maintain a facade of control. But the cameras betrayed her, catching every flicker of panic in her eyes, every desperate swallow as her son's truth ricocheted across America. Jasmine didn't sit back down. She remained standing, her silhouette commanding the studio lights, her gaze never leaving Daniel, who now seemed caught between collapse and liberation. Daniel, she said softly, her voice carrying like a bomb over the raw edges of the moment. The world isn't ending because you spoke your truth. The world is only beginning to see you as you are. Pam shot to her feet, her voice shrill with desperation. Stop speaking to my son like you know him. You don't know the sacrifices, the choices, the sleepless nights I endured to protect him from mistakes that would have destroyed any other young man's future. Jasmine turned to face her, eyes narrowing with controlled fire. Sacrifices protecting him. Pam, what you did wasn't protection. It was control. You didn't shield him from consequences to give him freedom. You did it to bind him tighter to your narrative. You wanted a perfect son to parade as proof that your politics work, even if it meant burying who he really was. Daniel lifted his head from his hands, his tear-streaked face raw and vulnerable, but also strangely defiant. She's right, Mom, he whispered, each word a dagger to Pam's carefully constructed image. You didn't save me. You silenced me. You made me live a lie every single day so you could stand on podiums and talk about law, order, and responsibility while I carried the truth like a chain around my neck. Pam's lip quivered, her voice lowering, almost pleading now. Daniel, everything I did for you. For your future, for our family's legacy. I couldn't let one mistake define you forever. He shook his head violently, tears spilling freely. But it did define me. Mom, it defined me in ways you'll never understand. Because every time you looked at me, I knew you weren't seeing me. You were seeing the version of me you created. The polished, fake Daniel you needed. And I can't breathe in that skin anymore. The audience sat spellbound, their silence louder than any applause, as the tension thickened into something visceral, something almost unbearable to watch. Jasmine stepped closer, her presence steady, commanding, but not predatory. She wasn't striking Daniel down, she was lifting him up in the only way someone in his position could be lifted, by telling him he had the right to exist outside of his mother's shadow. Daniel, she said firmly, The truth you just spoke can never be buried again, and you may not realize it yet, but you've given yourself the first taste of freedom you've ever known. Your future isn't gone, it's just finally yours to decide. Pam, shaking with fury, turned to Jasmine like a cornered animal. You've manipulated him. You've turned my son against me in front of the entire nation. You think people won't see through this. You think they won't recognize what you're doing, using a vulnerable young man as your pawn. Jasmine's lips curled into the faintest smile, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. No, Pam, I didn't turn him against you. You did that all on your own when you forced him to carry the weight of your lies. All I did was give him the space to speak, something you never allowed him. The host, sweat glistening on his brow, tried to step in, his voice faltering. We need to go to commercial. But his earpiece crackled with frantic voices from the control room. Don't cut away. Ratings are spiking. Let it run. So the cameras stayed, the stage lit, as America bore witness to the implosion of a family, a legacy, and a political brand all unraveling live. Daniel stood now, his chair scraping back with a screech that made the audience flinch. He turned to his mother, his voice louder, steadier. Do you know what it's like, Mom, to sit at your rallies, to hear you rail against criminals, against second chances, knowing I was the ghost in your speech, knowing I was the mistake you erased so you could look powerful? Do you know what it's like to feel like you don't even belong in your own skin because the world only knows the lie? Pam reached for him again, but this time he stepped back, away from her grasp, his distance widening under the glare of stage lights. Daniel, please, she begged, her voice breaking. Don't do this. Don't throw everything away. But he shook his head, his jaw tightening. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm finally taking it back. The audience erupted again, but this time it wasn't applause. It was a low, murmuring thunder, a collective realization that something irreversible had just happened. Jasmine stood silent, her expression unreadable, allowing the moment to breathe, allowing Daniel to own his truth without her voice overshadowing his. Pam, sensing control slipping like sand through her fingers, lashed out in desperation. This is a circus! This is an ambush! You've ruined my son's life for ratings, for headlines, for your own political gain. But Jasmine finally turned, her gaze searing through Pam like steel. No, Pam, I didn't ruin your son's life. What's ruining him is the suffocating grip of a legacy built on lies, a grip you tightened every time you covered the truth instead of facing it. And today, on this stage, in front of millions, he loosened that grip himself. That wasn't me. That was Daniel. The truth of her words hung in the air, undeniable, unshakable, while Pam Bondi, once untouchable, once the master of her narrative, looked smaller than she ever had before, reduced to a mother watching her empire crack and a son finally walking out from under her shadow. The studio lights seemed harsher now, exposing every crack in Pam Bondi's mask, every tremor in her voice, every tear streak that smudged her carefully curated image. Daniel stood taller than he ever had before, his chest heaving with the release of years of silence, but his eyes glimmered with something new. Resolve, Mom, he said, his voice echoing in the heavy silence. I can't carry your legacy anymore. I can't live for your speeches, your campaigns, your image. I need to live for me. And if that means the world sees me as flawed, then at least they're seeing me for who I really am. Pam staggered as though he'd struck her, reaching blindly for the desk to steady herself. You don't understand, she whispered, But the cameras caught it, and the microphones amplified it for millions to hear. Without control, without discipline, you'll fall apart. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her gaze like fire, and answered for him, "No, Pam. He won't fall apart, he'll finally be free. And freedom isn't weakness, it's strength you never gave him the chance to discover." Pam turned on Jasmine then, desperation transmuting into venom. "You think you're a savior, don't you? Standing there, playing the hero, dismantling a mother's life on national television. Do you know what it's like to carry a child, to build a future for them, to bleed for their survival, only to have that future ripped away by someone who doesn't even know them?" Jasmine didn't flinch. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and deadly sharp. "Do you know what it's like to be that child, Pam? To be silenced for the sake of your parents' reputation. To have your pain hidden so they can look powerful while you suffocate under their lies. You're not protecting him, you're protecting you." Daniel's head tilted, his jaw tightening, and his next words shattered the last fragments of her control. "She's right, Mom. All of this, everything you've done, it was never about me. It was about you. Your career, your power, your image. And I'm done being your shield." The audience gasped, some even clapping despite the tension, their whispers carrying through the studio like a storm surge. The host, overwhelmed, tried once again to regain order. We should really take a break." But his producers refused, knowing history was unfolding in front of their cameras. Pam's voice cracked as she lunged one last time to salvage her narrative. "Daniel, please, don't throw your life away on a spectacle. You don't know how cruel the world can be." His reply was ice and fire combined. "I do, Mom. I've lived it. I've lived it every day under your shadow, suffocated by your lies. But tonight, I'm finally breathing." He turned then, his eyes locking on Jasmine with a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you for letting me speak." Jasmine gave him a single nod, not claiming victory, not basking in the spotlight, but recognizing the courage it took for him to step into his own truth. Pam, cornered and unraveling, could only watch as her son, her carefully crafted hair, her silenced secret, took control of his own story. The cameras zoomed in on her face, catching the silent collapse of her composure, the trembling of her lips as she realized the empire she built on silence had crumbled in a single night. The control room whispered numbers into the host's earpiece. Millions watching live. Social media exploding. Hashtags spreading like wildfire. Pam Bondi meltdown. Faith Daniel speaks. Put truth on air. Daniel inhaled deeply, then walked to the edge of the stage. He turned to the audience, to the cameras, to the millions of unseen faces watching at home. Don't let anyone write your story for you. Not even the people you love, especially not them. The words, raw and simple, cut through the noise like a blade. And then, without another glance at his mother, Daniel walked off the stage, the studio doors closing behind him with a finality that reverberated in the bones of everyone present. Pam called after him, her voice breaking, "Daniel, Daniel, come back." But the sound of her desperation was drowned out by the applause of the audience, an applause not for her, not even fully for Jasmine, but for the young man who had finally broken free. Jasmine remained standing, her posture unshaken, her presence still dominating the room. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile, she simply turned to Pam, who now looked smaller than she had ever seemed, almost childlike in her unraveling. "Pam," Jasmine said quietly, but firmly enough for the microphones to catch, "this isn't my victory. It isn't even your loss. It's Daniel's beginning. And with that, Jasmine Crockett gathered her papers, gave the faintest nod to the stunned host, and walked calmly off the stage herself, leaving behind the wreckage of a fallen legacy and the echo of one truth that would ripple far beyond the studio walls. Sometimes the most powerful revolution begins with a single voice refusing to stay silent. The cameras lingered on Pam Bondi, standing alone in the harsh light, her empire collapsing in real time. As the broadcast faded to black,